never thought I would write about Bigfoot or anything out of this world because until recently, I didn't believe in those things. What happened this year has changed my opinion. I was just released from jail here in Ohio after sitting in a cell for 12 days. I was not charged with anything, but I was held with some sort of federal mumbo-jumbo so they could do an investigation. In January, we had record snowfall. It's about 11 inches. And to me, it was a perfect time to take off and work and go deer hunting. I love hunting in the snow. Now, I have a couple of felonies in my past. I spent 5 years in prison for beating the shit out of a politician's son who took advantage of my little sister. I'm not allowed to hunt with firearms, let alone own one, so I couldn't hunt the last day of muzzleloader season. That said, I do have an awesome Matthews compound bow, and there was an explosion of monster bucks in Ohio to hunt. One snowy Tuesday morning, I layered up and headed for private property near Tar Hollow that I have permission to hunt. I had been in my stand for over 8 hours. It was about 4:45 p.m., just before it started to get dark, when I busted a beautiful 14-point monster. I was already looking forward to getting my picture with this trophy. I let him have a half-hour head start before I started tracking his blood trail and his tracks. But there was another snowstorm coming in and the light was fading fast, so I had to back out. I knew he would be there in the morning. Even if the coyotes got to him, I would still have the mount. The next morning, I drove over to my brother-in-law's house and I had him bring his bloodhound out to follow the blood trail. His dog's name is Lovebug. He was an exceptional scent tracker for finding and recovering crippled deer. Well, we got to my stand around 9:30 that morning and the dog instantly took to the deer's trail. We had been following him for a quarter of a mile past where I tracked the buck the night before, when Lovebug suddenly refused to go forward. I continued to follow the clues left on the trail for another half hour when I finally found where the buck fell and bled out. But the buck wasn't there. There were giant tracks in the snow where some big boy came in and picked the deer up and walked off with it. Now, this dude must have been superhuman to be able to pick up that buck, since even I had to bring a roll-up sled to drag him out. Now, this guy must have simply thrown it over his shoulder and walked away with it. Well, I was pissed and I wanted my deer back, so I started following his tracks. For the next 2 hours, I followed those giant barefoot tracks until they led to a steep hillside and went straight up. I tried to follow their path, but I couldn't keep my balance, let alone scale the slope without falling and sliding down. I angled to a part of the ridge that was not very steep and finally got to the top and back on the trail. And an hour later, the prince pushed into the massive thicket. And there in the center was my buck, or at least what was left of him. All I could see was its head and rib cage. That was the moment that I realized that I was in a Bigfoot bedroom. All around the clearing were tracks of all sizes and flattened places in the snow where they had been sleeping. All I had with me was my bow, so I turned to get the hell out of there. But I stepped on something that rolled under my foot and I fell face first into the snow. I looked to see what I had fallen on and I realized that it was a human skull. I pulled my phone out, I took a picture of it, and then opened the Find My Car app on my phone and pegged the location. I sprinted back into the clearing and grabbed my buck's head and ran as fast as I could through the deep snow. When I was almost back to my truck, I heard some sort of roar in the direction of the thicket, and then I picked up my pace. As soon as I was in my truck and back on the road, I called the game warden and the state patrol to report what I had stumbled on, and then I met up with them at a local gas station. When all the authorities were present, I led them to the thicket and stood by as they started searching and collecting evidence. They even had a cadaver dog that located additional human remains under the snow. All I could do was stand there and be cold. And when I mentioned that my part was done and I was headed home, they insisted I remain where I was. It was well into the night when the group of other individuals arrived and asked me what I had seen and what I thought had happened there. Well, when I finished talking, I asked if I could go home and they refused, and I decided I was going home anyway. That might have been my mistake. One of the newcomers, who was a head taller than me, looked like a lumberjack. He grabbed me by the arm and swung me into a tree and handcuffed me before I could so much as grunt. They instructed one of the local cops to take me to lockup, and that's how I ended up in jail. Each day I was visited by two gentlemen from the federal government who asked me the same questions. Did I see the bear that took my deer? Did I know where the bear's den was? When I reminded them that the bears were in hibernation and it wasn't a bear that took my deer, they told me, wrong answer, and they would leave. Now, I might be a little slow, but it took me 11 days to figure out the answer they were looking for was yes. I saw the bear. It was a large black bear, but I did not find its den. I must have scared it off. The next morning, I was informed that I was not being charged for the criminal trespassing. Apparently, I had crossed the park's property lines and crossed over several private properties, too. The kick in the ass was that they kept my buck's head. I had moved it without calling it in and logging the kill, and I had not filled out my tag. I had just lost my job, spent over a week and a half in jail, and didn't get to keep my trophy. So screw the government. I'm telling what I found and saw. Even though I never saw a large hairy man, I did see tracks, and I can imagine the size and strength that it would take to lift a 200-pound buck. I saw the strides of these creatures, and I heard their roar, and I saw the killing field and all the bones that law enforcement discovered up there. My heart goes out to the families of those they discovered, knowing they probably will not even be told. I wish Steve Lilly were real and available. We could use him in Ohio. Signed, Bobby. Okay, I just thought that was an extra good story that was worth just putting in one podcast. I'm going to drop a short archived story behind this one, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. Ghosts on the Colorado River. I was 16 when I had my first trip down the Colorado River. The river runs through the Grand Canyon between Arizona and Nevada, and in my humble opinion, is the best way to see the national park in all its God-intended beauty. The river is 250 miles of glorious water, desert, and red rock, a great place for a kid to make some good money and absolutely nowhere to spend it. I first started running the river as what they call a swamper. A swamper is someone who gets a free trip in exchange for working their way down the river and helping the river guides. This starts with a day-long process to inflate and rig a 2-ton boat and load it with enough provisions to last 18 people a full week of eating surf and turf most nights. That's a lot of heavy lifting, and I soon became popular due to my strong work ethic and my strong back. And like most 16-year-old boys back then, I was happiest when I was picking up something heavy and flexing for the girls. After the first trip, I was hooked. They soon gave me an actual job, and I was promoted to a river guide in training. I started running as often as I could, going for months at a time and making great money for a 16-year-old kid. By the end of the season, it was hard to put on a shirt and put away my sandals and go back to a boring high school life. A typical trip on the river was a week long. They were divided up into 2 parts, the upper and the lower. The upper group of passengers would go float for 4 days and then helicopter out. At the same time, a new group for the lower part of the river would helicopter in. The upper had the best rapids, but the lower had more intrigue, and I'll get to that later. Passengers were usually tourists from the big city who had never so much as set foot on a dirt trail or rock, let alone spent 4 days in the middle of a hot, stinking desert. And at times us guides would cringe as we watched them walk around like aliens on a new planet, just waiting for them to twist or break an ankle. The area is so remote that hikers regularly go missing and are never found again. I once even had a local pilot lean over to me in a quiet voice and say, "Hey, if you ever need to get rid of a body, just let me know. I know where we can drop it out of my plane. No one will ever find it." Needless to say, that left me speechless. I couldn't tell if he was kidding, and I wasn't about to dig in and find out. But I digress. We did our best to protect our passengers, but I don't think they realized just how dangerous the trip really was. Between massive rapids that can pin you against a boulder and drown you, the freezing water that can quickly put you into hypothermia, and the poisonous wildlife, it was pretty much like walking through a minefield. I knew guides that had found actual bodies floating in the river. They just fished them out, wrapped them in a tarp, and dropped them off at the next helipad. Now that I write that, I admit it sounds worse than it really is. One thing our passengers didn't realize is that once you start floating down the canyon, it's nearly impossible to get out. The river passes through some of the most remote areas of the country, with sheer canyon walls up to 4,000 feet high. There are very few trails up to the rim, and injured hikers or boaters typically die before they get help, or if they're lucky, someone calls a helicopter and they pluck them out of the canyon. That's not as easy as it sounds, because cell phones don't have a prayer of working here. In the old days, we had to wait for a commercial airliner to fly overhead, and we'd contact them on the emergency radio channel. They would then radio the Park Service to arrange for a helicopter at a predetermined time and place. These days, satellite phones seem to work better, but even the narrow canyon walls can interfere with that signal. With all this said, the grandeur and the splendor of the canyon is worth all that risk. My personal favorite is the canyon walls in the morning light. It is nothing less than breathtaking. The beauty of this place still captivates me today and millions who visit. The river passes through Indian reservations, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Paiute, and the Wallapai, among others. This story is about a night we camped on the Wallapai side of the river. The trip had gone well up to this point, and we were at the end of a 4-day, and our passengers would be helicoptering out the next morning. The group was large enough that we had 2 boats to float the 30 passengers. These weren't the typical inflatable boats with oars. These are 30 foot long, and they sit 2 feet off the water. The design was originally used in World War II to support temporary bridges over the water. They have a metal frame inside, and they weigh 2 tons empty. To manage this heavy boat, there's a 25 horsepower motor on the back. The engine is for some propulsion, but mostly for steering the beast through the massive rapids. While these boats are quite large, they don't even compare to the size of the rapids in the canyon. I've seen many disappear into the rapids and held my breath as I waited for them to exit. It was getting late on day 4. We began looking for a place to camp. We had lingered long enough at lunch than we should have, and the day was quickly getting away from us. We passed several other river trips. Each time we would pause and ask where they were going to camp, and we quickly found out that our options were limited. We would have to camp at a location that was less than ideal. The guide I was with was very disappointed and even seemed on edge about the campsite. I was surprised, given that he was a 20-year veteran who had seen it all, and I'd never seen him get agitated like that. The campsite was fine, but it was not great. It was rocky with limited space for that many people to place their cots. But that was okay. The passengers didn't know any different, and we were not about to tell them. A predominant feature of the site was a steep and rugged canyon up above it. To a 16-year-old, it looked like a nice adventure after dinner, if the light held. And after I finished cleaning up dinner, I told the guy that I was going to hike or climb up through the canyon. He strongly discouraged me, and he told me that there was a Wallapai Indian burial ground just up above. He simply but firmly said, "Trust me, you do not want to go up there." I have to pause and talk about the Wallapai. I've come across many Native Americans in the canyon and surrounding areas, and many are guides and really great people. The Wallapai in those days even used to run their own tours down the river, and they were always easy to get along with. But with that said, the history of the Wallapai is a bit more colorful. The way the legend goes, it is that during the Indian Wars in the mid to late 1800s, the Wallapai, like most tribes, pushed back hard against the United States cavalry. Tensions were high, and both began using unsavory tactics. At one point, the son of a Wallapai chief was kidnapped and held for ransom. For some reason, the negotiations went south, and his son was killed. Since that day, visitors began disappearing on the reservation and on the river running through it. Most attributed it to skinwalkers and the locals delving into black magic. I only made it halfway up the canyon before I got an odd feeling, like I shouldn't be there. That feeling, along with the fading light, made me quickly turn around. I didn't want to be up there in the dark with that "I shouldn't be here" feeling in my gut, and I quickly turned around and I returned to camp. I think the other guide was relieved to see me come back, and it wasn't until later that night that he told me the last guy that went up there couldn't shake a bad feeling for months. He was convinced that the spirits of the dead Wallapai were following him around. He was always looking over his shoulder, and he felt like he was being watched. As you can imagine, that didn't exactly make me feel any better, and soon after, we all decided to turn in for the night. What ensued was one of the most restless nights of my life. It all started shortly before I went to bed. Most of the guides slept on the boat. I was sleeping on the front of the boat nearest to the shore. I was woken up by the sound of footsteps in the water, and at first this wasn't a real concern. Periodically, we'd have a sleepless or drunk passenger walking around at night exploring or a little bit lost. However, when I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, I didn't see a thing. This pattern repeated itself all night long. I must have woken up at least every hour. It was just before dawn, as the first hint of light entered the canyon, that I was nearly shaken out of my cot. In fact, both boats were violently shaken to the point that we all nearly were thrown overboard. 2 boats, nearly 6 tons fully loaded, were shaken like a toy. We all jumped up and looked around. We looked to see if perhaps river debris had bumped into us or maybe something fell off the boat. But everything looked to be in order, and these were big boats that were hard to move. Maybe I was dreaming this. After the initial shock wore off, the sleep set in and everyone went back to bed. I couldn't sleep, though. I'd been on edge all night, and now this happened. I sat there staring down into the brown, cloudy water, and then I saw it. It was something just below the surface. It was blurry, but something was definitely there. I leaned in to try to help my eyes focus in the dim light, and as I stared into the water, it seemed to draw me in. 2 dark spots slowly solidified to become eyes, piercing eyes that locked into mine. Not like looking at eyes in a picture, but eyes that moved to meet yours. Something with a consciousness, something almost like a new awareness came over me, like it had been there all along, but I hadn't seen it before. The nose and the mouth and the forehead and the chin all began to take shape. It was the face of an old Indian man with weathered skin and deep wrinkles. He wore a full headdress with feathers and beads. He appeared proud and defiant, almost royal. I was rattled by this revelation, shocked, and I jumped back. When I came back to look, he was gone. Over the course of the next 3 summers, I refused to camp at that site. Some of it was fear from my experience, but most of it was out of respect. My new respect for the dead of that place.